Thank you so much for talking to Autism Oz.
Pleasure. It's a really, really good project. I love the magazine.
Now, you were reading there from your book about the diagnosis of the boy.
Oh, yeah.
What was it like when you got the diagnosis for your son, Julius?
Well, I think the first thing parents do, you go into chronic denial. You just think that there's got to be a mistake. So then you bankrupt yourself, ricocheting around, seeing every medical expert on the planet. I mean, I hate to think how many doctors children have now put through university. I saw everyone from cranial massage therapists to, you know, aura feng shuiists to, you know, everyone I could think of, trying to get an answer to get rid of that diagnosis. Then I think the next phase a parent goes through, especially the mother, is such strong guilt. Your guilt gland just throbs because, of course, you think it's your fault. You think, was it something I ate? Was it something I didn't eat? Was it something I drank? Should I have had the pureed beetroot? You know, was it that one glass of wine in the final trimester or whatever? And, you know, I used to think, oh, if only I'd, you know, sort of feng shuied my yogurt like Gwyneth Paltrow and Organic Co, you know, everything would be fine. And then after that phase, you gradually start to accept, you go through a bit of the, oh, why me, why my family, that kind of thing. You feel sorry for yourself for a while. And then you start to accept that this is the little person you have, and you just have to do your best by them. And also you start to realise that they're quite exceptional, because the teachers at Julius's play groups were saying to me that he was retarded and he was globally affected, which doesn't mean they've got jet lag. It actually means, you know, they've got all these all over problems, and that he'd probably be in an institution. And yet at home he was asking me the most interesting questions. I mean, he was 4 years old and he was asking me things like, Mum, you know, what's the speed of dark? And one night I was chopping onions and he said, oh, Mum, if onions make you cry, are there vegetables that make you happy? You know, I kept thinking these are really wonderful, tangential, lateral questions. That this person's not retarded. They just see the world in a different way. So then I started to think there's no such thing as normal and abnormal. I now think there's ordinary and extraordinary. And I think they are extraordinary people. But of course, you know, they do have these problems in that they don't communicate effectively, they don't read body language, they're incredibly candid, they have no filter, so they just say exactly what they're thinking, which means that socially you're often kind of tiptoeing through a minefield. You know, I can give you many examples of when I've had egg, not just egg, but omelette dripping on my face from things my son has said.
When and how were you told? And you've always been known as a wit, the dab hand with the humorous, smart, witty comment.
Yeah.
How did you handle that diagnosis, being told that in the cold light of day? How was it told to you?
It was told to me very bluntly like that, autism, and it was like being branded with a big A. You know, it was just this very black and white term, and it was devastating. I mean, it was absolutely devastating. I was heartbroken. But also you feel a kind of lioness type overprotective love. Your claws come out and you just want to protect this child from the world. And of course that's a difficulty too, because if you can be overprotective, you know, how are you ever going to know if they can cope in the world if you never let them out into it? So, you know, that's part of this book that I've just written. It goes from when the first diagnosis to when he's about 16, really 17. Is the mother learning to let him go, when she starts to realise that, you know, she needs him maybe more than he needs her in a way, because you do become codependent. But no, it's devastating. And I for once, I had no quips. You know, I was absolutely quipless. You know, my black belt in tongue fu failed me, and I was really, you know, traumatised. But also, I didn't tell anybody. Jeff didn't want me to tell anybody because he was, you know, he was so devastated. So for a long time, you know, we just kept it with our family and friends. And then I decided also I didn't want to invade his privacy, so I didn't really write about it or talk about it till my son was 21, with his permission. And I'm really glad I have talked about it, because so many other parents have now written to me saying, well, mainly saying thank you for putting into words what their experiences are like. So first of all, they know they're not alone, and secondly, they can use it as a psychological shorthand. They can say, well, this is what it's like. You know, so other people will, their families will be more understanding. So having come out very tentatively and very nervously, I'm really so pleased that I've done it now.
And looking back with hindsight,
Yeah.
what do you wish you'd known back then 19 years ago that you know now?
Well, at the time, people didn't really know much about autism. They still don't really know a great deal about it. But we now know that it's not just the same for each child. We know there is this spectrum, and that, you know, it's flexible, and your child is somewhere on that continuum. And that the only reason you even use a label is as a signpost to get the right help. It doesn't mean that it defines them and confines them. You know, I think that's quite hopeful to know that there is that it's not just a sort of, you know, a life sentence of darkness and despair. So I think the best thing that's changed is that people are talking about it more. In fact, Asperger's, everybody knows about Asperger's. You hear people saying all the time, oh, my husband's a little bit Aspie. You know, so it's much more accepted and understood now. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book too, was to help to take the stigma away from the condition and show the positive, funny side of it as well. To show that it's not just all, you know, bleak despair. And I heard a guy on Radio 4 once in Britain talking about his autism. He's a scientist, because a lot of scientists, of course, are on the autistic spectrum. And he was saying, oh, you people think we're weird the way we don't make eye contact and the way we don't make small talk. He said, we think you're weird. He said, the amount of time you spend being nice to people you don't even like. And he said, if it weren't for people with Asperger's, human beings with autism, human beings would never have got out of the cave. And I thought, it's true. All those mad scientists were probably on the spectrum. And we now know with diagnostic hindsight that Mozart and Einstein and Van Gogh and H.G. Wells and Orwell and all these extraordinary people were probably on the spectrum.
So what do you advise parents who, like you, have just been told that their children have been diagnosed on the spectrum? Now you've come out and you're more public and you've become almost a representative face and an advocate.
Well, I think one of the really important things is to keep telling your child how wonderful they are, because all that happens to them in their whole day at school or whatever is they're told they're stupid, that they're wrong, that they're idiots. I mean, their self-esteem becomes limbo low. And you know, I do think also putting a child with special needs into an ordinary school is as pointless as giving a fish a bath. They do need specialist education. Because, I mean, most kids at school are striving to learn math and grammar. I mean, kids with on the autistic spectrum are striving to make themselves invisible. I mean, school is just such a hostile environment for them. So I think to all parents I would say, absolutely fight to get the right education for your child, if you can. I mean, it's incredibly hard. The waiting lists for special needs schools are so long, there's kind of prehistoric families waiting at the front. But keep fighting. I mean, they set up bureaucratic speed bumps all the time to stop you getting the right help because it's expensive. But it's much cheaper for society to educate these children cleverly and properly when they're young than to, you know, support them living in a bedsit on benefits for their whole lives, because they could contribute to society in the most interesting way if they could just get the right help in the beginning. So fight for their rights, but keep telling them that they're wonderful and interesting and unique, and how terrific it is to be like that. Because, you know, otherwise, their self-esteem sinks down lower than Britney Spears' bikini line.
So what was available for you when Julius was 3 and going forward into his education?
There wasn't much available then. I mean, I was bringing him up in Britain. So you get your child statemented there, it's called, which is a statement of special needs, where the education department is supposed to meet the special needs of your child. But because there's I don't know what they do in Australia, but in Britain they mainstream children with special needs, which was a well-intentioned idea that kids with autism could, you know, sort of blend in with ordinary people, ordinary children. But of course it doesn't work. They just end up being bullied, coming home with "kick me, I'm a retard" stuck on their back. And also it's not fair on the teachers. I mean, the inner city state schools in London, the poor teacher you know, she has to sort of, it's very multicultural. A lot of the kids don't have English as a first language. So she's trying to master it, you know, rudimentary Swahili and you know, Hindi and a little bit of Klingon. And then she's got all the kids with special needs who have their helpers as well. I mean, there could be 45 people in the classroom. You know, a sardine would feel cramped in there. You need a lubricant to get in for parent-teacher night. So I just think that is a bad idea. You really need to try and give them smaller classrooms, more one-to-one teaching, but not intimidated, and, you know, start to bring out their extraordinary IQ. Because my son is Wikipedia with a pulse. I mean, his IQ is so high. His verbal IQ is very high, but his other IQ is very low. There's always a big discrepancy between their you know, their IQ levels. So you try to bring that down altogether. I mean, he's brilliant, but he can't get the right change from the corner store. So they just need some more, you know, specialist attention. So
did he have other health issues at the time as he was growing up?
Well, he's got dyspraxia. I mean, he's got attention deficit disorder. They've got a whole mix of things. I always think they've got their own. He's got Julius syndrome, you know, and everyone's child, and they're nearly always sons, you know, much more prevalent with boys. They've got their own syndrome, but just those little labels just mean it helps you get the right speech therapy or the right occupational therapy, whatever, and that's really important.
And his diagnosis changed, didn't it, when you were told at 3?
Yes, it changed from autism to later on he was diagnosed as being Asperger's, which means it's more on the high functioning end of the autistic spectrum, but it still comes with its own baggage of problems. Yeah, but yeah.
And how did you find the diagnosis of the two differed for you?
Well, I was relieved that it was Asperger's, because the connotation is that they're a little bit more socially adept. And he grew out of his autism in a way. You know, he used to bang his head on the floor and was all repetitive behaviour and hated any change. Any change at all was excruciating for him. He still finds change hard, but he's much more engaged with the world around him than he was. So, you know, I think it is a more flexible condition. You know, it can, with maturity too, I think, especially with boys, they solidify a little bit more and they learn more social skills. So, you know, it does change.
You wrote the book, the novel, yeah, The Boy Who Fell to Earth.
Yes.
About a boy with Asperger's,
yeah,
and a single mom.
Yeah.
Were you compelled to write that?
I mean, it was in the back of my mind for a long time, but I thought I could never do it because I didn't want to invade my son's privacy, as I said. And then I started writing another book. You know, I was writing my 13th novel about the sex war, which is what I normally write about, because I think it's time we called a truce, you know, starting with you boys negotiating your terms of surrender. I started writing that book, and then this other book started pouring out of my pen, which can happen. And I thought, oh, I'm writing the book I knew I'd write one day. And I was kind of traumatized about it, because I thought, well, I don't want to talk about my son. I never have in the public, in the media. So I thought, well, I'll publish the book, but I won't say I've got a child on the autistic spectrum. And then a journalist asked me, because someone, you know, the word had got around a little bit through friends, and then I was traumatized, because I thought, I don't want to lie, because that would look as though I'm embarrassed of him. And the opposite is true. I'm so proud of him. So I asked Julius what to do, and he loves the book. I mean, he thinks will help people understand his condition. So he said, yeah, of course we'll talk about it. Yeah, it's time. So very, very nervously I started, because it's, you know, I use humour as a defence mechanism. You know, it's a way of being candid, but also deflecting. Yeah. So I had to sort of strip off to my emotional underwear. It was a psychological striptease that I found, you know, really terrifying in a way, to be so, you know, exposed about my own private life and my real emotions. But as I said, the response has been so wonderful.
Very tight-knit family. So unlike the novel where Lucy is a single mother,
yeah,
Geoffrey, your husband, your daughter, your son, the four of you are a very close-knit, supportive family.
Well, the reason I made her a single mother in the book is that, of course, often the fathers do leave, unfortunately, because of the stresses and the strains. But normally, it's the mother struggling on alone with the son. And I made her a single mother to emphasise the social isolation you feel as a parent too. Because, you know, I can remember going to the local playground with my son, and he would do something a little bit strange, and all the other parents would pull their child away, you know, as though your child had leprosy. And I used to call the sandbox, you know, the quicksand box, because I was always so nervous about when he sat in there, what was, you know, how long before the whole thing imploded. So I think other parents can be very judgmental. They look at you as though you're a bad mother because you're not controlling this child, and this child's so odd. You know, and I hope that when this book and other people speaking out about Asperger's will mean that the general public's a little bit more understanding of idiosyncrasies and eccentricities and being different, and learning to celebrate that and not be afraid of it. But yeah, it is very hard. It's exhausting. I couldn't wait for Monday mornings because the weekends were so shattering. You know, to get back to my desk was such a relief. It's because, you know, it just really is so tiring. It's having a child on the autistic spectrum is like having 10 children in one. It is full on, and it's 24/7, and it still is. My son's nearly 22, and he probably rings me 10 times a day. You know, I'm his best friend. He relies on me to decode social situations for him. You know, so it's really pretty much a full-time job.
One of the areas of life that we focus on in Autism Oz is life 18 plus, life beyond school.
Yeah, tricky.
How's Julius doing, and what are his plans going forward? He's 22 now.
Yeah.
What is he planning to do? What's he hoping to do? And how is he?
Well, he's gorgeous, by the way. He's absolutely lovely. If you met him, you'd be charmed by him. He's incredibly charming. But, of course, and he has his genius streaks. His memory is phenomenal. I mean, his obsession, when he was 5, it was Shakespeare. So he knew Hamlet off by heart, knew everything about Shakespeare. And then after that, it was the Beatles. Knew everything about the Beatles. We were at George Harrison's house once, and we knocked on the door, and this old woman opened the door, and Julius was about 7, and I said, "Oh, is George home?" And Julius just said, "Ah, Astrid from the Hamburg photo shoots." You know, he knew all about her and everything she'd done. We're like, God, this is extraordinary. And then after that, it became big Bill Brunsey and Big Bopper and Buddy Holly. He knew all about that era of music. And then it became tennis. I mean, he knows every match point of any game ever played on the planet. And when he meets tennis stars, he tells them every match point of every game they've ever played, which is kind of daunting for them. But, you know, he could be the world's best tennis commentator, although he might talk about Serena Williams' bottom. I mean, you don't, because if he has no filter, you're never quite sure what he might say, but it would never be boring. It would always be interesting. So at the moment, I've got him doing a sports journalist little course, but with help, with support. And I've got him volunteering. He's volunteering at the Old Vic Theatre because he's obsessed with Kevin Spacey. And Kevin Spacey's artistic director there. I've got him, he did volunteering at the Autistic Society, and he's volunteered at Oxfam. So he's doing volunteering work to get the idea of what it's like to be in the workforce. But I think you can't, we had a couple of bad experiences, like with the Autistic Society when he was volunteering there, because he didn't have support. Now I send a support worker with him until he feels comfortable and learns the ropes.
In our magazine, we focused on the scandal of bullying of children on the spectrum, and the 62 to 65% of all children in schools who are on the spectrum who are being bullied. What were your families, what were Julius's experiences like?
Well, he just hated school because of that. I mean, I had to drag him screaming every day of his life. And I would come home, you know, bruised, kicked in the shins, and also an emotional wreck, and have to lie down on the carpet in the fetal position for half an hour, sobbing, because I was taking him somewhere that he found terrifying. And the reason he found it so terrifying was because he was ridiculed, you know, made to feel stupid and wrong and, you know, inept. And that was really, really difficult. And you know, once he had one of the kids bashed him, he had to have stitches in his head. So eventually I took him out of the state school system. And even though I'm a Labor supporter, I totally believe in state education, but it was just failing him so badly And then, of course, you know, then you bankrupt yourself going through the private system. But even in the private system, at least the classrooms were smaller and they were more on top of the bullying because they didn't have so many children to watch over. But even then, it still persisted in that environment. So I think a big part of it is educating other kids at school. And you know, there's an article in your magazine at the moment talking about getting kids to experience what it's like to feel disconnected, and you know, putting headphones on so you can't understand what people are saying to you, and trying to write with gloves, you know, if you've got a bit of dyspraxia so you can't form the words. And that kind of education of other kids would help so much. And that's something I'd really like to encourage in the education system, to see the world through other people's eyes.
So we've talked about Julius's future. What's Kathy Lette's future in the autism community? I have a checklist here which says advocate for more education assistance, particularly beyond 18.
Yeah.
Advocate for beyond 18 groups. Advocate for this, advocate for that.
Yeah.
How do you see your future within this community?
Well, I think there's a film being made of the book starring Emily Mortimer. So first of all, that's going to be wonderful because cinema reaches many more people than literature, unfortunately. But at least that will help people to start talking about Asperger's a little bit more. I may write a sequel now about the dating years because that's so fraught but so funny. You know, I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail about my own son's life, but he has my jaw on the floor quite a lot because he tells me so much. So I think that would be really funny. I'd like to do one more book, I think, about Asperger's. And apart from that, I suppose what I'll be doing is maybe going around giving talks, supporting other parents. And you know, often if I do a book signing, it just turns into a sort of self-help group where we all end up hugging and crying and laughing and kissing and all become good friends. You know, so it makes its own support group as we go around. And I think sometimes that's just all you want to know as a parent of a child with Asperger's. A, that there's hope, and B, that you're not alone, that all of us have the same, you know, emotional terrain to traverse. And as long as you know you're not alone, I think you can go. But also, I wrote the book because my son once said to me he felt he was drowning in his own brainwaves. So I thought, well, this could be a little literary life raft to sort of help him cope and help him realise that he's wonderful, unique, and absolutely darling.
Do you wish you'd written it earlier?
I couldn't have written it any earlier. I wasn't ready. You know, you have to write a book when it's boiling, when it's coming, when it's bubbling up. And yeah, I wrote it at the right time.